So to revisit our steps to complete the square, this is the same steps you had yesterday, where your first step is to find 1/2 of your b term. So that would be our, everything's that way here, I can't write. We wrote that yesterday as our first step was you always take b divided by 2. And our next step was to square the result of step 1. So we're squaring the number we got out for b divided by 2. So you wrote that as b divided by 2 squared. And then we would always add this to our standard form because we're making a c term. In the homework, you start off by saying find your c. That's what you're making by doing all these steps. So this last step would look like x squared plus bx. And your c term you get from up above. This is plus b divided by 2 squared. So now that is in a standard form of a quadratic. You have an ax squared plus bx plus your c. And then we went through and we did our factoring steps, and then we solved equations from there. We're going to do that again today. We're just going to kind of, our setup is going to look different, and kind of just, it's going to be just a little bit of a challenge starting the problems. Otherwise, all the steps are the same. From what I saw yesterday, everybody had a pretty okay time with doing this. So, example 1a, we have our setup here. On one side, you're always going to look for, you're going to get your x squared and your bx alone. This is so many technical difficulties. I want to write with this pen. Get out of my way. Actually try. Okay. Now I know what I'm doing. We get this piece on its own, and then we start our completing the square. We would have to divide our b term by 2, so our b term here is -2. Always remember to take the sign with your b term. So we'll take -2, I'll do it off to the side here, -2 divided by 2. That would give us -1, and then we have to square -1. We're squaring the result. So we'll take -1 squared. That's -1 times -1, which gets us a +1. So that's what we're going to be adding to both sides of our equation. Since we now have an equation, that means we're trying to set up and solve. So we'd write kind of your next step as x squared minus 2x. And then in red here, I'm adding a 1 to this side. And if I add a 1 to my left-hand side, I have to add it to my right-hand side as well. So I have to add 1 to both sides. Now I made a trinomial on my left-hand side. And now I'm going to have a term over here. And it's going to be, most of the time, we'll get a perfect square. Some examples today, we won't get a perfect square, and we'll learn how we deal with that. So from here, then you go into your factoring. We're going to factor our trinomial. So you factor by using your x method. Your a times your c goes on the top. So 1 times 1 goes up here. And then your b term, -2, will go on your bottom. All right. So think to yourself for a moment, and you can put it on your paper. Two numbers that when you multiply them, you multiply to a 1, but when you add them, you get to -2. Remember, then two numbers on the side are always going to be the exact same. So multiplying to 1, the factors of 1 are just 1 in itself. So it's either +1 and +1 or -1 and -1. Since we're adding to a -2, we have to add two negatives together. So this would be -1 and -1 on either side. We take that -1 and the -1 and we write it as our two factors. So it'll be x minus 1 and x minus 1. Then we can combine 3 plus 1 on this side to get 4. we're going to want to condense what's on our left-hand side. We can write this instead of two terms. We can write it as one term. So to kind of show this can combine. So this is just x minus 1 squared is equal to 4. And then we'll go take the square root of both sides. So now once we go through all these steps, now we're just solving, right? So to undo that square, we're trying to figure out what x is. That means we have to take the square root of both sides. When we take the square root of something in parentheses, we're left with just what's inside the parentheses. So we're left with x minus 1. And then on our right-hand side, we take the square root of 4. Square root of 4 could be positive 2 or it could be negative 2. So we write plus or minus 2. And we're trying to solve for x, so x isn't by itself yet. We need to get x all the way by itself. So we can do that by moving this 1 over, by adding 1 to both sides. So we have x is equal to 1 plus or minus 2. And this plus or minus symbol gives a lot of people issues. It's kind of, I think they overcomplicate it. To get your two answers for x, you get two answers for x. You're going to do two different things. The first time, you're going to take 1 plus 2. So 1 plus 2 is 3. So that's one of your answers. And then the second time, you do the other operation, 1 minus 2. So 1 minus 2 is negative 1. So that's how you get your two answers. You can always go back and check by plugging these into your original and seeing if both sides equal each other. In this case, they would. 3 and negative 1 are both answers to our quadratic. So that was an example like we had yesterday. Straightforward. Looking at example 1b, this has to be, we don't want two equal signs. This should be a plus. No, this should be a plus 12. So change that. So to start off completing the square, we just need this part on its own. So we don't want that 8 there. We want the 8 on the other side. And just because our 0 now, our equal sign is all the way over here, our steps are still the same. We're going to move our 8 over. So we'll subtract 8 from both sides. So now on this side, we're left with negative 8 is equal to, and then what's underlined will just stay. We haven't touched that at all. X squared plus 12x. So now we'll go through all our same steps. We got to complete the square. So our b term here is 12. So take 12 divided by 2, which is 6. Then we have to square 6. So 6 squared, or 6 times 6, is 36. We're always making a perfect square. So we take this 36, and we add it to both sides. So I'm going to do that in a different color. We do negative 8 plus 36 is equal to, this would be x squared plus 12x plus 36. All right. We'll go through, simplify each side. Let's do this side now. Our trinomial is now on the right-hand side of our equal symbol. We're still going to do the same steps though. Even though it's not over there, it's over here now. We can still follow all the same steps. We're going to want to factor this. If we use our x, we'd have a 36 on the top and a 12 on the bottom. So we need two numbers that when we multiply them, it's to a positive 36. When we add them, it's to a positive 12. We know to get 36, it's 6 times 6. 6 plus 6 is 12. So on either side, we'll have 2 6s. So we can simplify. Negative 8 plus 36 is 28. And then on our other side, factoring this out, it'll be x plus 6, x plus 6. And you don't always have to write this step. If you want to go straight to writing this as x plus 6 squared, you can do that. Just save an extra line of writing. If you know that from this step, you just go to this step. You don't have to show that. That's equal to 28. All right, and from here, you're always going to start by taking the square root. We take the square root of both sides. And whoop. On our left-hand side, square root of 28 is not a perfect square. So this is the first case where we don't have a perfect square. So what we're going to do is we're going to simplify our square root as much as we can. So I'll do this to the left now. This is where we try to figure out, in 28, what is the largest perfect square that goes into 28. So we check our list of perfect squares. 1, 4, 9, 16, 25, 36. And we could check. 36 doesn't divide 28 evenly. 25 doesn't divide it evenly. 16 doesn't. 9 doesn't, but 4 does. 28 divided by 4 is 7, and 4 is a perfect square. So we could split this up into our tree where we do square root of 4, square root of 7, and then we can simplify. Square root of 4 is 2, square root of 7 is what we leave underneath our square root. So this will be 2 square root of 7. And again, but when we take the square root of it, it needs to be plus or minus. So that has to be plus or minus the square root of 7, and that'll go as our simplified answer on our left-hand side. Yes, Luco. Yes. So we simplified, we have plus or minus square root of 7. The right-hand side, we just have that x plus 6. And then we have to subtract 6 from both sides, because we want to get x by itself. Subtract 6, subtract 6. So we'd have negative 6 plus or minus 2 square root of 7 is equal to x. So what I would do is you can type this onto your calculator just as is. If you type one of them in as negative 6 plus 2 square root of 7, you'll get an answer out for x. It'll be a decimal and you'll just approximate it. And then you'll do the same if you type it out the other way. Negative 6 minus 2 square root of 7. You get an answer for x. Now grab my calculator and do that. So I'm going to type it in exactly as I see it. Let your calculator do the work for you. So negative 6 plus 2 seconds square root of 7. We get about negative 7.7. Negative 0. We'll say we're round to the 100th, so 7.1 is one of our answers for x. Other answer, we take negative 6 minus 2 square root of 7. We get out negative 11 point, this would be 29. So there we have 2 answers for x. This is up here what we would call our exact answers. which we dealt with earlier in the unit, but now we're kind of going to approximated answers. It's where we actually go through and use our calculator to get out a number. All right. So the next two problems that I want to show on here are, if given your setup just looks a little funky. In this case, we only have an x squared by itself, and it's equal to 16 minus 6x. But you always just have to remember, if we're using this specifically to complete the square, to start, we need to have x squared. It could be plus or minus, but we'll just write it as plus. Bx is equal to, whatever on one side. So to start, we need to have your x squared term and your x term on one side. So this negative 6x needs to move over to here. So to move anything from one side of the equation to the other, I just do my opposite operation. So the opposite operation of subtraction is adding. So I would add 6x to both sides. So my new equation will look like x squared plus 6x is equal to 16. Now this is like a problem, just like how we had at our first example. We start by completing the square. So 6 divided by 2 is 3. Then you square 3. That's equal to 9. So now I have to add a 9 to both sides. X squared plus 6x. Then I add a 9 to this side. And I add a 9 to my other side as well. So I keep my equation balanced. And from here, we factor. Think of what are two numbers that multiply to 9 but add to 6. Well, that would be 3. So that's what our x would look like. 9 and 6, 3 and 3. So I can write this right away as x plus 3 squared. I know it seems like as we're going through these, like a lot of steps to write, but like once you get practice with these, like you don't necessarily have to write your x each time. Like it's gonna multiply to your back number and add to your middle number. Well, you can kind of visualize that in your head, a 9 on the top, 6 on the bottom. That's to be 3 and 3. You can also do kind of finding your C term in your head just by dividing 6, squaring it. That's something I would expect that we could do. But we can also simplify like that in our head. That's 25, 16 plus 9. The 25 here. And then your steps are just the same. Take the square root of both sides, and 25 this time is a perfect square. So you don't have to worry about doing any simplifying of square roots. So on one side we have x plus 3. On the other side we have plus or minus 5. So to get x by itself, we have a plus 3 here. So to move the 3 to the other side, so we're going to need to use subtraction. So that's our opposite operation in this case. Subtract 3, subtract 3. So x is equal to negative 3 plus or minus 5. So again, to get your two answers for x, the first time you use addition. Negative 3 plus 5 is 2. And then your second time you use the other operation, which is subtraction. Negative 3 minus 5 is negative 8. So there's your two answers for x. All right. I'm going to give you a few seconds just to sit and look at example D, this last one we're going to do together. Decide what you would have to do to be able to start this problem to complete the square. And here's my hint. You have to move two things. Right? So decide, based on what I moved in this problem, I said what our setup had to be. In example C, how would you set up problem D? So take a second, figure that out, maybe put some ideas down on your paper, and then we'll do the rest of it together. If you get past that, keep going through. See how far you can get without stopping. So jumping back into this, we need to have to be able to start completing the square. We need our x squared and our x term on the same side. So this 20 has to move to the other side. So that's what I'm going to do first. I'm going to subtract 20x from both sides. So I'd be left with x squared minus 20x plus 14 is equal to 0. But now I only want this piece over here, just like I had in my last problem. So this 14 then needs to be moved over to the other side. So those are two things I have to move. I have to move 20x over to this side and 14 over to the other side. So to move a positive 14 over, I have to subtract 14 from both sides. So minus 14 and minus 14. So then we're left with x squared minus 20x is equal to negative 14. And now I'm going to show you kind of like me doing these steps in my head. Now you could do your work. Your next step, like we've done in all the other problems, would to be find your C terms, so the number you're going to add to both sides. So find that, we split negative 20 in half, so that's negative 10, and then we square it. So negative 10 times negative 10 is positive 100. So I'm going to be adding a 100 to each side. X squared minus 20x plus 100 is equal to, this would be negative 14 plus 100 on this side as well. Yes. The what? From dividing negative 20 by 2, negative 10, and then squaring it, getting 100. So this number will always be positive 2 if you haven't picked up on that pattern yet. So this, you need two numbers that would multiply to 100. So if you visualize your x in your head, 100's on the top, negative 20's on the bottom. So it has to be negative 10 and negative 10. That multiplies to a positive 100, but it adds to a negative 20. So I could say this is x minus 10 squared. And then we have to simplify our right-hand side. And then we're going to have to, it's not going to get out a perfect square. So we get 86. So now we have to square root both sides. Square root, square root. So this side is x minus 10. But since 86 is not a perfect square, we have to go and do our simplifying to the side. We have to try to break that down. So I'm going to look what I had instead of trying to do this. You'd have to see what's the largest perfect square that goes into 86. I always think if it's an even number, I always try doing my even numbers first as kind of a check. In this case, we actually cannot. That's what I thought. There's no perfect square that goes into 86. All right, so this is our kind of our case where we would write our final answer. We can't split it up at all. No perfect square goes into it, so we'd write this as plus or minus the square root of 86. So if you want to add like the note, you can't simplify. So then our last step, add 10 to both sides. So x is equal to 10 plus or minus the square root of 86. And then that again, you'll use your calculator to do that. So your two answers, if you were to approximate them, x would be about 0. We'll do your addition first, 19.27. And then your other answer would be 0.73.